1%. Out of 8 billion human beings alive on this planet right now, only 1 in 100 is born with natural red hair. That is roughly 80 million people, fewer than the population of Germany, spread across every continent, every culture, every ethnic group in the world. And yet for thousands of years, those 80 million people have been burned at the stake, accused of witchcraft, celebrated as gods, feared as demons, and studied by scientists who cannot fully explain why they exist in the first place. What is the genetic explanation? What does a mutation in a single gene actually do to a human body? And why, after tens of thousands of years of natural selection that should have either spread a useful trait or eliminated a harmful one, does red hair remain frozen at exactly 1% of the global population, clustered in the northwestern corner of Europe, appearing almost nowhere else on Earth in any meaningful concentration? The answer begins with a gene called MC1R. And once you understand what that gene actually does, not just to hair color, but to pain, to brain chemistry, to cancer risk, to the entire physiology of the people who carry it, you will never look at a redhead the same way again. Every human being on Earth carries a gene called the melanocortin-1 receptor, MC1R for short. It sits on chromosome 16 and it controls one of the most fundamental biological processes in the human body, the production of melanin, the pigment that gives color to your skin, your eyes, and your hair. When MC1R is fully functional, it operates like a precisely calibrated switch. When your skin is exposed to ultraviolet radiation from the sun, the hormone alpha MSH is released by damaged skin cells and binds to the MC1R receptor on the surface of melanocyte cells, the specialized cells that produce pigment. The receptor activates, and the melanocyte is instructed to produce a dark, rich UV-absorbing pigment called pheomelanin. That is what tanning is. That is what brown and black hair is. That is what dark skin is. Pheomelanin is nature's sunscreen. It absorbs ultraviolet radiation before it can penetrate into the DNA of deeper cells and cause the mutations that lead to cancer. But in people with red hair, the MC1R gene is mutated. When the MC1R is mutated, it loses some of its function, and instead of producing dark pigments, it makes red-yellow pigments called pheomelanin. If a person has natural red hair, their melanocyte cells produce predominantly pheomelanin, not eumelanin, pheomelanin, a red, orange, yellow-tinted pigment that does not absorb UV radiation the way eumelanin does. It does not protect the skin. It does not trigger a tan. It scatters light in the specific wavelengths that the human eye perceives as red and orange, which is why red hair ranges from deep auburn to pale strawberry blonde, depending on exactly how much pheomelanin is present and how many melanin-producing cells are active. The color you see in a redhead's hair is not a presence of something unusual. It is the absence of something usual, the near-complete removal of the brown-black protective pigment that most of humanity carries as a biological shield. So why would this mutation survive? Why would natural selection, which is ruthless, which eliminates traits that reduce survival, or keep a mutation that strips away UV protection in populations that live on an island in the North Atlantic, where the sun is weak and the skies are gray for half the year? That question is one of the most debated in human population genetics, and the answer is more complicated, more contested, and more revealing than almost anyone expected. These red hair variants in MC1R likely first appeared in ancient humans around 30,000 to 80,000 years ago, at about the same time as early migrations out of Africa. The original human populations that left Africa carried the equipment for dark skin and dark hair, full-function MC1R, high eumelanin, maximum UV protection. That equipment made sense in equatorial Africa, where UV radiation is intense enough to cause catastrophic DNA damage if the skin is not shielded. But as populations migrated north and west, into Eurasia, into the cloudy latitudes of Europe, into the gray skies of the British Isles, they entered environments where UV radiation was so reduced that the calculus changed entirely. The sun was no longer a threat to be blocked. It was a resource to be captured. Because human skin produces vitamin D using UV radiation. In low UV environments, dark skin becomes a liability. It blocks the limited UV light available, and people cannot synthesize enough vitamin D, which is critical for bone density, immune function, neurological health, and dozens of other biological processes. In low UV environments, fair skin and reduced melanin production become survival advantages. But here is where the red hair story gets strange, because that reasoning, that fair skin evolved in Northern Europe because it allowed better vitamin D synthesis, explains pale skin. It does not explain red hair specifically. You can have pale skin and blonde hair without an MC1R mutation. Scandinavians managed it perfectly well. So why did the MC1R mutation that produces red hair concentrate in Ireland and Scotland in particular? Scientists used to think red hair evolved to help people produce vitamin D in chilly places with little sunlight. But more recently, data suggests that genetic variants associated with red hair became common in northern latitudes by chance. That is the conclusion that population geneticists have arrived at after decades of debate. Not natural selection for an advantage, but genetic drift, a random fluctuation in allele frequencies in a small isolated population that happened to get locked in. The MC1R mutation that produces red hair appears to have drifted to high frequency in the ancestral populations of the British Isles. Not because it gave those people a survival edge, but because the founding population happened to carry it in higher than average proportions, and then centuries of relative geographic isolation, the Irish Sea, the North Sea, the mountains of Scotland, preserved and amplified it. Scotland holds the highest concentration of red-haired individuals globally, with approximately 13% of its population having red hair. Ireland follows with about 10%, and critically, in both Ireland and Scotland, over 40% of the population carry the recessive gene for red hair, meaning they carry one copy of the MC1R mutation, but don't express red hair themselves. They are silent carriers. Hidden redheads, in a sense. People who will never have red hair themselves, but who can produce red-haired children if they partner with another carrier. Does that change how you think about the rarity of red hair? Because it is not as rare as it appears. It is a sleeping giant in the gene pool of northwestern Europe, suppressed by the recessive nature of inheritance, waiting for the right two people to meet. In 2007, a team led by Nobel laureate Svante Pääbo successfully sequenced DNA from Neanderthal remains and discovered a mutation in the MC1R gene that would have resulted in red hair and pale skin. Let that land for a moment. The team extracted DNA from the bones of a 43,000-year-old Neanderthal from El Cedron in Spain and a 50,000-year-old individual from Monte Cassini in Italy. They found a functional MC1R variant. When they inserted it into melanin-producing human cells, it suppressed pheomelanin production and shifted the output toward pheomelanin, the same red-orange pigment that colors the hair of modern redheads. Scientists concluded this helps confirm that Neanderthals likely sported the whole range of hair color seen today in modern European populations, from dark to blonde, right through to red. So Neanderthals had red hair too. Does that mean redheads today are carrying Neanderthal genetic inheritance? The science here is one of the most fascinating cases of convergent molecular evolution ever documented. Paleogenetics revealed that the specific MC1R mutation found in Neanderthals is completely absent in modern humans. The two species arrived at the same physical result, red hair, pale skin, through completely different mutations in the same gene. Same outcome. Different molecular route. This is what scientists call convergent evolution. The exact same phenotype produced twice independently in two different lineages, tens of thousands of years apart. Both Neanderthals and early modern humans, migrating into the low UV environments of Ice Age Europe, found the same biological solution to the same environmental challenge. And they found it through different paths in the same gene. That is how powerful the pressure for vitamin D synthesis was in those northern environments. Evolution found the answer twice. The fact that our version is different from theirs, but achieves the same effect, is one of the most elegant pieces of evidence for natural selection ever uncovered. But here is the part that should truly unsettle you. Red hair is a recessive trait. That means a person needs to inherit two copies of the MC1R mutation, one from each parent, to actually have red hair. If you only inherit one copy, you won't have red hair. You'll be a carrier. A silent carrier with normal-looking hair who has no idea they're one partner away from producing a red-headed child. So why does red hair remain so rare globally if the mutation has been accumulating in European gene pools for tens of thousands of years? Because you need both copies from both parents. In populations where the carrier frequency is 40%, the probability of two carriers meeting and producing a child who inherits both mutant copies is not negligible. But it is not the majority. Most encounters between two carriers produce non-red-haired children. The mutation persists, spreads slowly, stays hidden in heterozygous carriers, and surfaces at the rate that the math of recessive inheritance dictates, which is, globally, around 1%. Now comes the part that changed medicine. In 2004, a team at the Cleveland Clinic published a study in the journal Anesthesiology that the medical community still hasn't fully processed. They recruited women with naturally bright red hair and women with dark hair. They induced anesthesia with sevoflurane and maintained it with desflurane, standard volatile anesthetics used in operating rooms worldwide. Then they delivered a calibrated noxious stimulus and measured how much anesthetic was required to prevent a pain response. The result was unambiguous. Redheads require 19% more inhaled general anesthesia than their dark-haired counterparts. The lead researcher, Dr. Daniel Sessler, put it in terms that surgeons could not ignore. If you are walking down the street, there is nothing that you can see in somebody that will tell you how much anesthesia they need except red hair. No other visible human trait, no other genetic characteristic you can observe without laboratory testing. Nothing in the physical appearance of a patient tells an anesthesiologist anything useful about dosing, except red hair. A surgeon looking at a red-haired patient on an operating table knows, from that observation alone, that this person will likely need more anesthetic to achieve the same sedation as a dark-haired patient. A subsequent study conducted in 2009 found that red-haired patients also required higher levels of anesthetics to numb the pain of dental procedures, which is why many redheads have a historically documented fear of dentists that turns out to be not irrational at all. They were feeling more pain than they should have been because local anesthetics were underperforming. Why? The connection runs back to the MC1R gene, but through a pathway that nobody expected. MC1R is just one type of melanocortin receptor. Other types relate to brain function. And the mutation that affects MC1R may also affect those other melanocortin receptors. The melanocortin receptor system is not just a pigmentation system. It runs through the entire body. There are 5 melanocortin receptors, designated MC1R through MC5R. MC1R, the one mutated in redheads, controls pigmentation in the skin. But MC2R through MC4R control things like adrenal hormone production, energy metabolism, and critically, pain signaling in the central nervous system. When you mutate MC1R, you don't just change the pigment switch. You alter the behavior of a receptor family that has its hands in processes from hair color to how your brain processes pain signals. There is recent evidence that redheads are more tolerant to local anesthetics and more sensitive to opioids. They need more of one class of drug. They respond more strongly to another. Their pain experience and their pharmacological response to drugs that modify pain is genuinely different, not dramatically, not pathologically, but measurably, consistently, and in ways that have direct clinical consequences when you're lying on an operating table and someone is deciding how much of a sedative agent to put into your bloodstream. Does this mean red hair is a disadvantage? Does it mean the MC1R mutation is, on balance, harmful? The answer is one of the most fascinating in all of genetics, and it is not a simple yes. Here is the dark side of the MC1R mutation, and it is genuinely dark. Scientific studies have demonstrated that pheomelanin itself can damage DNA, not just indirectly, by failing to shield skin from UV radiation. Directly, pheomelanin, the red-orange pigment that floods the skin cells of every natural redhead, is chemically unstable in the presence of certain reactive molecules. It undergoes oxidation reactions that generate free radicals, chemically reactive species that attack and damage the DNA strands inside skin cells. This means redheads face a cancer risk that operates through 2 entirely separate mechanisms simultaneously. The first is the obvious one. Without pheomelanin's UV-absorbing shield, more ultraviolet radiation penetrates into the skin and directly damages DNA. Pheomelanin has weak shielding capacity against ultraviolet radiation relative to pheomelanin, and has been shown to amplify ultraviolet A-induced reactive oxygen species. The second mechanism is independent of UV radiation entirely. Studies in mouse models found that pheomelanin synthesis is carcinogenic by an ultraviolet radiation-independent mechanism, meaning a red-haired mouse kept in complete darkness, never exposed to a single photon of UV light, still develops melanoma at elevated rates compared to a dark pigmented mouse, because the pheomelanin itself is generating oxidative damage from the inside. Research from the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute and the University of Leeds showed that even a single copy of a red hair-associated MC1R gene variant increased the number of mutations in melanoma skin cancer. The burden of mutations associated with these variants is comparable to an extra 21 years of sun exposure in people without this variant. 21 years of sun exposure. Simply from carrying one copy of the MC1R mutation, not 2 copies, not being visibly red-haired, just carrying one silent copy. The non-redheaded carriers walking around in Ireland and Scotland with their 40% carrier frequency are accumulating UV-equivalent DNA damage silently, without ever standing in sunlight more than the next person. The risk for melanoma can vary from 10 to 100 times that of people who don't carry the gene variants, 10 to 100 times. That is not a minor statistical adjustment. That is a categorically different risk profile. A natural redhead looking at sun protection is not being cautious in the same way that a dark-haired person is being cautious. They are managing a fundamentally different biological reality, a skin that produces a pigment that both fails to protect and actively contributes to carcinogenic processes, operating simultaneously through 2 separate pathways. And yet the mutation persists. It survives. In Scotland, it reaches 13% of the visible population, with silent carriers at 40%. After tens of thousands of years of natural selection, a mutation that dramatically elevates cancer risk and alters pain processing, remains fixed in a significant fraction of Northern European humanity. Why hasn't selection eliminated it? Because cancer typically strikes after reproductive age. Natural selection operates on traits that affect reproduction. Traits that either prevent you from surviving to reproduce, or that reduce the number of children you have. Melanoma, historically, is a disease of middle age and later life. It kills people who have already had children, which means it applies almost no evolutionary pressure at all. The mutation that causes red hair passes to the next generation long before it causes cancer, and natural selection cannot see it. The MC1R mutation is, in the language of evolutionary biology, nearly neutral, slightly costly in certain environments and at certain life stages, not costly enough at the right stages of life to be eliminated. And in the specific demographic bottlenecks of the Irish and Scottish founding populations, it drifted to high frequency by chance and then stayed there. But there is something else, something that the scientific literature touches on and has not yet fully explained. When researchers induced the Neanderthal MC1R mutation in human cells, they found that it impaired MC1R activity, a condition that leads to red hair and pale skin in modern humans. Found in cell membranes, MC1R is a receptor that acts as a switch between production of the red and yellow pigment pheomelanin and the black and brown pigment eumelanin. The same switch exists in woolly mammoths. Researchers found a mutation in mammoth MC1R that may have led to blonde or pale mammoths. The same mutation causes light coloration in mice. The same gene, slightly altered, producing lighter pigmentation in species separated by 80 million years of evolutionary divergence. This tells you something profound about how deeply conserved the melanocortin receptor system is. It is ancient. It was solving the problem of pigmentation before humans existed, before primates existed, before mammals had separated into their current lineages. MC1R is one of the oldest functional elements in the vertebrate genome. When it mutates in a human being in County Cork or the Scottish Highlands, that mutation is occurring in a molecular machine built by hundreds of millions of years of evolution. And it is doing so in a way that shifts the output from one ancient pigment pathway to another, producing a physical appearance that two different hominin species arrived at, independently, on the same cold, cloudy continent, tens of thousands of years apart. That is what red hair is. It is not a quirk, it is not a fluke. It is a window into one of the deepest genetic mechanisms in vertebrate biology, operating in living people today, producing effects that run from the obvious, the color of someone's hair, to the deeply counterintuitive, the amount of anesthesia they need in an operating room, the rate at which their skin cells accumulate cancer-causing mutations, even in the dark, the particular sensitivity of their nervous system to temperature and pain. Consider what happens inside the body of a 5-year-old red-headed child in Glasgow or Dublin. Every day, in every melanocyte cell across the surface of their skin, the MC1R receptor is failing to activate the eumelanin pathway. Pheomelanin is being produced instead. It is depositing in the hair follicles and turning the growing hair red. It is sitting in the skin cells, where it will undergo slow oxidative reactions that damage DNA over the course of a lifetime. The child's melanocortin receptor system, which extends into the central nervous system, is subtly calibrating their pain response in ways that won't become clinically visible until they sit in a dentist's chair and find that the Novocaine isn't working, or lie on an operating table and wake up too soon. None of this is visible to the naked eye. You can see the hair color, you cannot see the biochemistry, and that is what makes genetics so unsettling as a science. The visible surface is never the whole story. The MC1R mutation produces red hair as almost a side effect of a much more profound shift in cellular chemistry, and that shift touches processes from DNA integrity to neurological pain processing to cancer biology, all cascading from a single change in a single gene on chromosome 16. There are at least 8 genes linked to red hair, according to research conducted by the University of Edinburgh. MC1R is the primary driver, the major architectural gene, but it doesn't work in isolation. Modifier genes influence the depth of the red, the precise shade, the presence of freckles, the degree of sun sensitivity. The trait that looks like a single characteristic is actually a coordinated output of a genetic network, with MC1R at the center and a constellation of other genes modulating the signal. This means red hair is not simply recessive in the way that basic genetics textbooks describe. It is recessive at the level of the primary gene, but influenced by a background of modifier variants that shift the phenotype towards strawberry blonde or deep copper or bright auburn. 2 people, who each carry 2 copies of the same MC1R mutation, can have visibly different hair colors depending on what other genetic variants they carry. 3 loss-of-function single nucleotide variants in MC1R have been established as strongly correlated with red hair, and their coefficients differ by 2 orders of magnitude. 2 orders of magnitude. The same type of mutation at 3 different positions in the same gene has dramatically different effects on how red the hair actually becomes. Red-headed people make up between 1 and 2% of the world's population, but about 6% of the UK population. That asymmetry tells you everything about what geography does to genetics. The same mutation that has almost vanished from East Asia, from Africa, from the Middle East, from South Asia, exists in 6% of the people in one small archipelago off the coast of northwestern Europe. It is not distributed randomly. It is not scattered proportionally across humanity. It is concentrated in one place at high enough frequency to be noticeable, to be culturally significant, to become the basis for centuries of myth, legend, persecution, and folklore. Redheads have been called witches, burned in medieval Europe, accused of being born during menstruation or fathered by the devil. They have been considered lucky in some cultures and cursed in others. In ancient Egypt, red-haired men were reportedly sacrificed to honor the god Set. In Polynesia, red hair is considered a sign of noble ancestry. In Celtic culture, red hair was associated with power and magic. In every case, the cultural response to red hair is disproportionate, far beyond what a mere color variation would seem to warrant, which suggests that humans have always intuited, at some level, that redheads are not just differently colored. They are different in some more fundamental way that is hard to name but easy to feel. And the science now tells us why that intuition might not have been entirely wrong. They do feel pain differently. They do respond differently to drugs. Their skin chemistry is running a different program than everyone else's. The physical appearance is the least of it. The 1% who have red hair are carrying a mutation that is approximately 30,000 to 80,000 years old. That mutation arose independently at least twice in human evolutionary history. Once in the lineage that became modern redheads, once in the Neanderthal populations of Ice Age Europe, and produced the same physical result from a different molecular mechanism. It is a mutation that fails to protect against UV radiation in 2 different ways simultaneously. It alters pain sensitivity and anesthetic response. It persists at stable low frequencies because it doesn't kill people before they reproduce. And it is concentrated with extraordinary density in a handful of northern European populations because of genetic drift, founder effects, and the particular bottlenecks of post-Ice Age settlement. What does all of that tell us about why only 1% of the world has red hair? It tells us that the question was never really about hair. It was about a gene that controls pigmentation at the surface and pain sensitivity at the level of the nervous system that dates back to a time before Ireland existed as a place and before Scotland existed as a culture, that 2 entirely different species of humans solved the same way in the same cloudy latitudes, and that remains in the gene pool of 80 million people today, silently shaping their experience of cold, of heat, of pain, of the dentist's needle, of the surgeon's anesthetic. Without most of them knowing anything about it at all, the 1% who carry it visibly are easy to count. The 40% who carry it silently in northwestern Europe are not. And somewhere in that hidden reservoir of unexpressed mutation, the story of where red hair came from, how it survived, and what it does to the body of every person who carries it, that story is still being written. The genetics is not done. The research is not finished. Every new study adds another layer to a picture that began with a single question about why some people have unusual hair, and ended up reaching into the deepest mechanisms of human biology, evolutionary history, and what it means when a body runs a slightly different program than everyone around it. The answer is not simple. It never was. But it starts on chromosome 16, in a gene called MC1R, in a mutation older than agriculture, older than written language, older than every civilization that has ever burned a redhead or worshipped one. And it is operating right now in every one of the 80 million people alive today who carry 2 copies of it and are walking through the world with hair the color of copper and fire.